The morning sun reflected off the polished cars at Luxury Motors dealership as Walter Thompson parked his old Toyota Camry in the visitor's lot. The 72-year-old man checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, straightening the collar of his well-worn but clean plaid shirt. His dark skin showed signs of age, but his eyes sparkled with the same intelligence that had helped him educate thousands of students over his 40-year teaching career. Walter grabbed his trusty leather briefcase from the passenger seat and stepped out of his car. The briefcase was a gift from his late wife Martha, given to him on their 20th anniversary. Though the leather was cracked and the handle slightly loose, he couldn't bring himself to replace it. Some things, he believed, carried value beyond their appearance. As he walked toward the gleaming glass doors of the dealership, Walter couldn't help but notice his reflection. He saw what others might see: an elderly black man in simple clothes, someone who might look more at home at a discount store than a luxury car dealership. But Walter knew appearances could be deceiving. Martha had taught him that lesson long ago. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of cool air-conditioned breeze. Inside, the showroom sparkled like a museum. 5 pristine vehicles sat on rotating platforms, their paint jobs reflecting the overhead lights like mirrors. The floor was so clean Walter could almost see his face in it. Behind the main counter, 3 salespeople huddled together, all wearing matching navy blue blazers with the dealership's logo. As Walter entered, their conversation stopped abruptly. You could feel their eyes on him, studying him, judging him. The youngest one, a man with perfectly styled blonde hair, whispered something to his colleagues, and they'd all struggled to hide their smirks. Walter pretended not to notice. He'd experienced similar reactions throughout his life, and he'd learned that maintaining dignity was more important than confronting every slight. Instead, he focused his attention on the beautiful Mercedes-Benz S-Class displayed in the center of the showroom. Its sleek silver body and elegant lines reminded him of the cars he used to sketch in his notebooks during boring faculty meetings. Martha would have loved this one, he muttered to himself, walking slowly around the vehicle. The price tag caught his eye: $125,000. Walter allowed himself a small smile, thinking about the expression these salespeople would wear if they knew about his investment portfolio. Minutes passed and still, no one approached him. Walter could hear the salespeople continuing their hushed conversation, punctuated by occasional snickers. He noticed a young couple enter the dealership, and immediately, 2 salespeople rushed to assist them. They were younger than Walter, dressed in expensive casual wear and white. Finally, after 15 minutes of being ignored, Walter approached the counter. The blond salesman, whose nameplate read Brad, gave him a dismissive look. "Can I help you?" Brad asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be doing anything else. "Yes, I'm interested in the S-Class," Walter replied politely, pointing to the silver Mercedes. Brad's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged glances with his colleagues. "The S-Class? Sir, are you aware of the price point of that vehicle?" Walter nodded calmly. "Yes, I am. I'd like to discuss the features and possibly arrange a test drive." Brad didn't bother hiding his amusement now. "Look, sir," he said, emphasizing the word sir in a way that made it sound more like an insult. "There's a used car lot about 3 miles down the road. They have some nice, more suitable options that might better fit your budget." The other salespeople weren't even trying to hide their laughter now. One of them, a woman with perfectly manicured nails, covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with poorly suppressed giggles. Walter gripped his briefcase tighter, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that came with such encounters. He'd faced discrimination before, but it never got easier. Still, he kept his voice steady and his head high. "Thank you for your suggestion," he said quietly, "but I think I'll be going now." As Walter turned to leave, he heard Brad say to his colleagues, "Can you believe that? Some people just don't know their place." The automatic doors closed behind him with the same soft whoosh, but this time, Walter barely heard it over the blood rushing in his ears. He walked to his Camry with measured steps, his back straight despite the weight of humiliation on his shoulders. But as he sat in his car, a determined look crossed his face. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, they would learn an important lesson about judging books by their covers. After leaving the dealership, Walter drove home slowly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The weather was beautiful, with birds chirping and children playing in their front yards, but he barely noticed any of it. The laughter of the salespeople kept echoing in his mind. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror again. The same face looked back at him, dignified, weathered by time but still strong. He remembered what his father used to tell him. Son, your worth isn't measured by how others treat you, but by how you treat others in return. Walter pulled into the driveway of his modest two-story house. It was the same house where he and Martha had raised their children, where they had hosted countless Sunday dinners for students who couldn't go home for the holidays. The paint was a little faded, and the garden wasn't as perfect as when Martha was alive, but it was home. Inside, he placed his briefcase on the kitchen table and made himself a cup of tea, a habit he'd picked up from Martha. His hands shook slightly as he poured the hot water, but not from age. The anger and hurt he'd been holding back at the dealership were finally surfacing. Walter sat in his favorite armchair, the one that still held a slight impression of Martha's favorite cushion. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hi, Dad," his daughter Sarah's voice came through the speaker. "How are you?" "I've had better days, sweetheart," Walter replied, his voice heavy with the day's events. Sarah, a successful lawyer in Atlanta, immediately picked up on his tone. "What happened?" As Walter described his experience at the dealership, you could hear Sarah's angry intake of breath. "Dad, you should sue them. I can file a discrimination case right now. This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be exposed." Walter smiled at his daughter's protective instinct. "No, baby, there are better ways to handle this." "But Dad, they humiliated you. They treated you like you were nothing." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "They treated me the way they thought I deserved to be treated," Walter corrected gently. "And tomorrow, they'll learn why that was a mistake." After calming Sarah down and promising to call her the next day, Walter walked to his home office. The room was lined with photographs: his graduation from college, his marriage to Martha, their children's births, his 40 years of teaching mathematics at the local high school. What most people didn't know about was the drawer full of investment statements and stock certificates. Walter pulled out his laptop and logged into his investment account. The numbers on the screen would have shocked Brad and his colleagues at the dealership. Years of living below his means, smart investments, and compound interest had turned his teacher's salary into a small fortune. He owned significant shares in several companies, including the parent company of Luxury Motors. He picked up his phone again, this time calling his investment manager, Michael. "Walter, how are you?" Michael's warm voice greeted him. "Michael, remember that conversation we had about taking a more active role in the companies we invest in?" Walter asked. "Yes, of course. You've been one of our largest individual shareholders in several companies for years. Many boards would love to have someone with your background in education and community service." "Well," Walter said, his voice taking on a determined edge, "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about Luxury Motors. Their customer service needs some significant improvements." After finishing his call with Michael, Walter made one more call, this time to James Chen, the regional director of Luxury Motors. As he explained his experience and his position as a major shareholder, Chen's response was exactly what he hoped for. Walter went to bed that night with a plan in place for tomorrow. As he lay in the darkness, he thought about what Martha would say. She had always taught their children that revenge wasn't the answer, but education was. Tomorrow, he would teach those salespeople a lesson they wouldn't forget. Before falling asleep, Walter smiled for the first time since leaving the dealership. Tomorrow would indeed be very interesting. He set his alarm early and laid out his best suit, the one Martha had insisted he buy for their daughter's law school graduation. It was time to show those salespeople that books shouldn't be judged by their covers, and some lessons came with a very high price tag. That evening, after making his phone calls, Walter walked to the wall unit in his study. He pulled out an old photo album bound in brown leather, its pages thick with memories. Sitting in his comfortable armchair, he began turning the yellowed pages carefully. The first photo showed a young black man in a graduation gown, standing proudly in front of a brick building. It was Walter in 1973, graduating with his mathematics degree. He had been one of only 3 black students in his class. His father, a janitor who worked 2 jobs to help pay for Walter's education, stood beside him beaming with pride. "You were right, Dad," Walter whispered to the photograph. "Education is the key that opens all doors." He turned another page. This one showed him on his first day as a math teacher at Jefferson High School. He was wearing a new tie that Martha had bought him specially for the occasion. His smile was nervous but excited. That day, he had made a promise to himself that he would make mathematics accessible to every student who walked into his classroom. More photos followed. Walter teaching at the chalkboard, Martha grading papers beside him late at night. Their first house which they had saved for years to buy. Then came pictures of their children, Sarah and Michael, growing up. Through all the images, one thing remained constant: Walter and Martha's careful planning for the future. Walter posed at a particular photo taken in 1985. It showed him standing next to Mr. Chen Sr., James Chen's father, at a small investors' meeting. That was when Walter had made his first significant investment in what would later become Luxury Motors' parent company. He remembered how people had questioned his decision to invest most of his savings in the company. A teacher playing the stock market, they had said, but Walter understood numbers better than most. He had taught his students that mathematics wasn't just about solving equations. It was about seeing patterns, understanding growth, and planning for the future. Next came a series of newspaper clippings that Martha had carefully preserved. Local teacher establishes anonymous scholarship fund. Read one headline from 1990. Walter smiled, remembering how he had used his early investment gains to help promising students attend college. The article didn't name him as the donor. He had always believed that good deeds didn't need publicity. Another clipping showed the results of his students' math competitions. Year after year, Walter's students had achieved the highest scores in the state. Many of them had gone on to become doctors, engineers, and business leaders. Some even worked on Wall Street now, and they still called him for advice. Walter pulled out a more recent document from his desk, his latest investment portfolio statement. The numbers would have shocked most people who knew him as just a retired teacher. Through careful investing and compound interest, his initial investments had grown into millions. He owned significant shares in several major companies, but his largest holding was in Luxury Motors' parent company. His phone buzzed with a text message from one of his former students, now a successful investment banker. "Mr. Thompson, just heard about tomorrow's meeting. Those dealership people won't know what hit them. Want me to come as backup?" Walter texted back, "No need, David. Sometimes the best lessons are taught quietly." Looking at another photo of Martha, taken just a year before cancer took her from him, Walter felt tears in his eyes. She had always been his moral compass, teaching him that wealth wasn't about showing off or getting revenge. It was about making a difference in people's lives. He picked up a framed certificate from his desk, an award for 40 years of teaching excellence. Below it was a handwritten note from a former student. "Mr. Thompson, you taught me more than math. You taught me that dignity and kindness are worth more than any amount of money." As night fell, Walter carefully put away the photos and documents. Tomorrow, he would teach one more lesson, but not about mathematics. This lesson would be about assumptions, respect, and the danger of judging people by their appearance. Before going to bed, he looked at one last photo. Martha on their wedding day, her smile radiant with love and hope for their future. "I'll handle this the way you would have wanted, dear," he whispered. With grace, but with purpose. Sleep didn't come easily to Walter that night. He sat in his kitchen, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside him. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but his mind was too busy planning for tomorrow to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smirking faces of the dealership staff. At 1 a.m, Walter walked to his study and turned on his computer. He opened his email and began to write to James Chen, the regional director. "Dear Mr. Chen, I appreciate you taking my call earlier today. As discussed, I believe tomorrow's visit will be eye-opening for everyone involved. I want to make one thing clear. My goal is not to punish, but to educate." He paused, thinking carefully about his next words. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him that change happens through understanding, not through fear. Walter continued typing. "I would like to use this situation to create a training program for all dealerships in your network. Every customer, regardless of their appearance, deserves respect." After sending the email, he called his investment manager, Michael, despite the late hour. He knew Michael would be awake. The man seemed to never sleep. "Walter," Michael answered on the first ring. "I've been looking at the numbers. You realize you could buy that entire dealership if you wanted to." Walter chuckled softly. "That's not the point, Michael. I don't want to own it. I want to change it. Well, you're in a perfect position to do that, Michael replied. The board has been looking for someone to head their new diversity initiative. With your background in education and your significant shareholding, you're an ideal candidate. Walter sat up straighter in his chair. An idea was forming in his mind, one that went beyond just teaching the dealership staff a lesson. He thought about all the other people who might have walked into that showroom and faced the same treatment he had. Michael, he said slowly, I want you to prepare a full presentation of my investment history with the company, and I need you to contact our lawyer, Janet. We're going to draft a proposal. Next, Walter called his daughter Sarah, knowing she would still be awake working on case files. Dad, is everything okay? Sarah answered, concern in her voice. Everything's fine, baby. I need your legal expertise. How do we structure a corporate training program that becomes mandatory for all employees? For the next hour, Walter and Sarah worked on the outline of a comprehensive training program. It would cover not just diversity and inclusion, but also customer service and respect. Sarah's legal knowledge helped ensure it would meet all corporate requirements. Around 3 in the morning, Walter received a response from James Chen. Mr. Thompson, your proposal is excellent. I've taken the liberty of flying in tonight. I'll meet you at the dealership tomorrow at 10 a.m. I believe this could be the wake-up call our entire organization needs. Walter smiled as he read the email. Tomorrow was taking shape exactly as he had hoped. He went to his closet and pulled out his best suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes. Martha had always said it made him look distinguished. He laid it out carefully, making sure there were no wrinkles. Next to the suit, he placed his briefcase. But this time, instead of being filled with just memories, it contained documents that would change lives. His investment portfolio, the training program proposal, and his credentials from 40 years of teaching. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, Walter finally lay down to rest. He thought about Brad and the other salespeople at the dealership. Tomorrow, they would learn that respect wasn't just about good manners. It was about good business. Sometimes, he mumbled sleepily, the best lessons come from unexpected teachers. Just before falling asleep, Walter looked at Martha's photo on his bedside table. Her smile seemed to approve of his plans. Tomorrow wouldn't be about revenge or humiliation. It would be about teaching, about change, and about making sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. The alarm was set for 7 a.m. In just a few hours, Walter Thompson, the retired math teacher they had laughed at, would show them exactly why it never pays to judge a book by its cover. At exactly 9:45 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the Luxury Motors parking lot. James Chen, the regional director, stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. He checked his watch and smiled when he saw another car approaching, Walter's Toyota Camry. Today, Walter looked different from yesterday. His charcoal gray suit fit him perfectly, and his silver tie clip caught the morning sun. When he stepped out of his car, he stood straighter, no longer carrying the weight of yesterday's humiliation on his shoulders. Mr. Thompson, Chen called out, walking over to shake Walter's hand. It's an honor to finally meet you in person. My father spoke highly of you after that investment meeting in '85. Behind them, a third car pulled up. Janet Martinez, Walter's lawyer, emerged carrying a leather briefcase much newer than Walter's old one. She had been handling his legal matters for 15 years and knew exactly how he wanted to handle this situation. Shall we? Walter asked, gesturing toward the dealership's entrance. Inside, the showroom was already busy. Brad and the other salespeople were huddled near their usual spot, laughing about something. The dealership manager, Tom Wilson, was at his desk reviewing papers. None of them had noticed the 3 people entering. Good morning, Chen said loudly, his voice carrying across the showroom. The effect was immediate. All conversations stopped. Brad's laugh died in his throat as he recognized Walter. Tom Wilson's head snapped up. His eyes widened as he recognized James Chen. He rushed forward, almost tripping over his own feet. Mr. Chen, we weren't expecting you today. What a pleasant surprise. Chen's face remained neutral. Mr. Wilson, I believe you met Mr. Thompson yesterday. He gestured to Walter. The color drained from Wilson's face as he looked at Walter, then back at Chen. Ah yes, hi, that is. Actually, Walter spoke up, his voice calm and clear. You didn't meet me yesterday. No one here did. They were too busy judging me by my appearance to actually speak with me properly. Brad and the other salespeople had inched closer, trying to understand what was happening. Brad's usual smirk was replaced with a nervous frown. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in your office, Mr. Wilson, Janet suggested, her tone professional but firm. Wilson nodded quickly, leading them to a large conference room. The salespeople watched in confusion as their manager held the door open for Walter, the same man they had mocked just yesterday. Inside the conference room, Chen didn't waste time. Mr. Thompson here owns 3.2% of our parent company's shares. He's been one of our largest individual investors for over 30 years. Wilson's jaw dropped. Brad, who had been called into the room with the other salespeople, suddenly found his shiny shoes very interesting. But more importantly, Walter added, opening his old briefcase, I'm an educator. I've spent 40 years teaching young people that what matters isn't how someone looks, but who they are inside. He pulled out several documents and laid them on the table. Yesterday, your staff provided me with a perfect example of why our company needs a complete overhaul of its training programs. Janet stepped forward, distributing copies of a detailed proposal. Mr. Thompson has developed a comprehensive training program focusing on customer service, diversity, and respect. The board has already approved its implementation across all dealerships. Chen nodded. And this location will be our test site. Mr. Thompson will personally oversee the program's implementation here. The salespeople shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Brad looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but Walter wasn't finished. I could have handled this differently, he said, looking each person in the eye. I could have demanded your jobs, filed lawsuits, or taken my story to the media, but that wouldn't solve the real problem. He paused, thinking of Martha and what she would say. Instead, we're going to learn from this. Together, we're going to make sure no customer ever feels the way I felt yesterday. Wilson, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke. Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say except, we're deeply sorry. Walter nodded, accepting the apology, but knowing that actions would speak louder than words. As he looked around the room at the shocked faces, he knew that today's lesson was just beginning. The tension in the conference room could be cut with a knife. Janet opened her briefcase and pulled out more documents while James Chen stood at the front of the room, commanding everyone's attention. Let me make sure everyone understands exactly who Mr. Thompson is, Chen began, his voice firm but controlled. Besides being one of our largest individual shareholders, he has a background that makes him uniquely qualified to help us improve. Walter sat quietly, watching the faces around the room. Brad kept glancing at the door as if planning an escape route. The female salesperson who had laughed at him yesterday was now staring at her hands, her cheeks red with shame. Mr. Thompson spent 40 years teaching mathematics, Chen continued. During that time, he helped hundreds of students get into college through an anonymous scholarship program he created. Many of those students now work in our company's offices across the country. The revelation caused a stir in the room. Tom Wilson's eyes widened even further. Anonymous scholarship program, he whispered. Walter nodded. Yes, one of your junior managers, David Chen, was actually one of my students. He didn't know I was his scholarship donor until 5 years ago. James Chen smiled. David is my nephew. When he found out Mr. Thompson was his mysterious benefactor, he couldn't stop talking about how this man had changed his life. Janet stepped forward, laying out more papers on the conference table. Mr. Thompson has been selected to head the company's new diversity and customer experience initiative. This dealership will be the first location to implement his program. That's not all, Walter spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. Yesterday, while you were all laughing at the old black man in simple clothes, I was actually here to make a significant purchase. I planned to buy 5 vehicles. The salespeople's faces showed a mix of shock and regret. Brad looked like he might be sick. 5 vehicles? Wilson asked weakly. Walter nodded. Yes, I was going to buy cars for each of my top students who recently graduated from medical school. I do this every few years, help my former students start their careers with reliable transportation. He pulled out a stack of photos from his briefcase. These are some of my previous students with their cars. Many of them bought them from other dealerships in our company's network. Dealerships that took the time to treat them with respect, regardless of their age or appearance. The photos showed young doctors, lawyers, and business professionals standing proudly next to their new cars. Many of them were minorities, all of them successful, all of them grateful to their former teacher who had believed in them. Mr. Thompson's investment portfolio with our company is worth over $20 million, Chen added, causing several gasps around the room. But more valuable than his financial investment is his commitment to education and positive change. Brad finally found his voice, though it shook slightly. Sir, about yesterday, I don't know what to say. Walter looked at the young salesman thoughtfully. Yesterday, you told me to know my place, he said quietly. Well, this is my place. I'm a teacher, an investor, and now, I'm the person who will help ensure that no other customer experiences what I experienced. Janet distributed more documents. The new training program will begin next week. It's a comprehensive 6-month course that will be mandatory for all employees. But what about our jobs? One of the salespeople asked nervously. Walter leaned forward. I believe in second chances. I've spent my life giving them to my students. This program isn't about punishment, it's about growth. Those who embrace it will have opportunities to advance. Those who don't. He let the sentence hang in the air. James Chen nodded in agreement. Mr. Thompson insisted that we focus on education rather than termination. He believes people can change if given the right guidance. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. The man they had mocked and dismissed just yesterday wasn't just wealthy. He was now effectively their teacher and supervisor. Walter stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Now, he said, looking around the room, shall we discuss those 5 cars I'm interested in purchasing? I believe Brad here can help me with that. His smile was kind, but his eyes held a lesson none of them would ever forget. The next few hours at Luxury Motors were unlike anything the staff had ever experienced. After the meeting, Walter sat with Brad to discuss the purchase of 5 Mercedes-Benz vehicles. The young salesman's hands trembled as he worked on the paperwork, barely able to look Walter in the eye. Brad, Walter said gently, watching the young man struggle with the forms, do you know why I asked specifically for you to handle this sale? Brad looked up, confusion and shame mixing on his face. To punish me, sir? He asked quietly. Walter shook his head. No, because yesterday you showed me exactly what needs to change in this business. And today, you're going to learn how to do it right. As they went through the sales process, Walter took time to explain things from a customer's perspective. He shared stories about his students who had faced similar discrimination, not just at car dealerships but throughout their lives. Brad listened, and slowly, his shame began to turn into understanding. Meanwhile, James Chen was meeting with Tom Wilson about the immediate changes needed at the dealership. Wilson sat in his office, his face pale as Chen listed the complaints they'd received from other customers over the past year. Mr. Thompson's experience wasn't unique, Chen explained, showing Wilson a folder full of customer complaints. We just got lucky that this time it happened to someone who can help us fix the problem. In the showroom, other salespeople watched nervously as Walter and Brad worked together. The woman who had laughed at Walter yesterday approached him during a break. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I want to apologize for my behavior yesterday. I never felt so ashamed of myself. Walter looked at her name tag. Lisa, right? When she nodded, he continued, Tell me something. Do you enjoy making people feel small? No, sir, she replied quickly. I just went along with everyone else. I never thought about how it made people feel. That's the problem, isn't it? Walter said. We often don't think about how our actions affect others. But starting today, that's going to change. Janet spent the afternoon setting up the framework for the new training program. She turned the dealership's conference room into a temporary classroom, arranging for new training materials to be delivered and scheduling expert speakers for the upcoming sessions. By late afternoon, Brad had finished processing the paperwork for all 5 vehicles. His hands had stopped shaking, and he was actually paying attention to Walter's guidance. The total sale was over $500,000, the largest single transaction in the dealership's history. You know what the irony is, Brad? Walter asked as they finished the final forms. If you had treated me with respect yesterday, you would have made this sale then. Think about how many other sales you might have missed because of quick judgments. Brad nodded slowly. I understand now, Mr. Thompson. But why are you being so kind to me after how I treated you? Walter smiled, thinking of Martha. Because someone once gave me a chance when I needed it. My first principal hired me when many schools wouldn't consider a black math teacher. He saw past what others couldn't. Sometimes, people just need someone to believe in them. As the day drew to a close, James Chen gathered everyone in the showroom. Starting tomorrow, he announced, this dealership begins its transformation. Mr. Thompson's training program will be comprehensive. It's not just about selling cars. It's about treating every person who walks through those doors with dignity and respect. Walter stood beside Chen, looking at the faces before him. Some showed remorse, others showed fear, but a few, including Brad, showed something more important, a genuine desire to change. Success in business isn't just about making money, Walter told them. It's about building relationships, treating people right, and earning trust. These are the lessons we'll learn together. Brad stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, will you be teaching the training sessions yourself? Walter nodded. Some of them, and I'll bring in some special guests too, including some of my former students who are now successful professionals. They'll share their experiences of being judged by their appearance. As the staff began to disperse, Walter noticed something different in their demeanor. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a mix of humility and hope. The first lesson had been taught, not through humiliation or revenge, but through wisdom and grace. 6 months had passed since that memorable day at Luxury Motors, and the dealership was almost unrecognizable. The showroom sparkled as always, but now it buzzed with a different kind of energy. Customers of all backgrounds walked in and out, each one treated with the same level of respect and attention. Walter sat in what had become his regular spot, a comfortable chair in the corner of the showroom where he could observe the day-to-day operations. He smiled as he watched Brad assist an elderly Asian couple, noting how the young salesman pulled up chairs for them and listened patiently to their questions. Amazing change, isn't it? James Chen said, approaching Walter with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Walter and sat down beside him. Indeed, Walter replied, taking a sip. Did you see the latest customer satisfaction numbers? Chen nodded proudly. Highest in the region. The board is implementing your training program nationwide now. 10 other dealerships have already started. They watched as Lisa, who had once laughed at Walter, warmly welcomed a young black woman in casual clothes who had just walked in. There was no hint of prejudice or judgment in her manner, just genuine professional courtesy. Mr. Thompson, Brad called out, walking over after finishing with his customers. Remember that idea we discussed last week about the community outreach program? Walter nodded, encouraging him to continue. Well, I worked on the proposal, Brad said, pulling out a folder. I thought we could partner with local high schools, offer internships, maybe even create a scholarship program similar to what you did. Walter felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. 6 months ago, this was the same young man who had told him to know his place. Now, Brad was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the dealership's transformation. The training program had changed more than just customer service. The staff had learned about implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. But more than that, they had learned to look beyond appearances and recognize the humanity in each person who walked through their doors. Tom Wilson, the dealership manager, joined their small group. Mr. Thompson, you won't believe who just called. Remember David Chen, your former student? He's been promoted to Vice President of Operations, and he wants to feature our dealership in a national campaign about corporate culture change. Walter smiled, thinking about David, the shy student who had struggled with mathematics until Walter spent countless extra hours helping him understand. Now he was a vice president in the company, proving once again that investment in people always paid off. The elderly Asian couple that Brad had been helping walked past, beaming with pride as Brad handed them the keys to their new car. The husband stopped to shake Brad's hand, saying something that made the young salesman's face light up with genuine pleasure. You know what the best part is? Brad said, joining the group after his customers left. We're actually selling more cars than ever. Turns out, treating people with respect is good for business. Walter nodded. Success often comes down to simple things: dignity, respect, and understanding. These aren't just nice ideas, they're essential business practices. As the afternoon sun streamed through the showroom windows, Walter pulled out his old briefcase, the one Martha had given him. Inside, along with his usual papers, was a new photograph. It showed the entire dealership staff at their training program graduation ceremony last week, all smiling proudly with their certificates. Martha would be proud, he said softly to himself, touching the worn leather of the briefcase. Lisa approached their group with excitement. "Mr. Thompson, remember those 5 doctors you bought cars for? Well, 3 of their colleagues just walked in. They said the doctors recommended us specifically because of how they were treated here." Walter looked around the showroom, at Brad confidently helping customers, at Lisa's genuine enthusiasm, at Wilson's proud smile, and at Chen's satisfied expression. This was more than just a business transformation. It was proof that people could change when given the right guidance and opportunity. In the end, the greatest lesson wasn't taught through humiliation or revenge. It was taught through patience, wisdom, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. Walter Thompson, the retired math teacher they had once mocked, had taught them the most valuable lesson of all: that true success comes not from what you have, but from how you treat others.